Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Along with Jim Geraghty of National Review, I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today. All of it brought to you by Quip. That's right, the fabulous electric toothbrush starting at just $25. And if you go to getquip.com/martini right now, you can get your first refill pack for free. Much more on Quip and the great products you can get there a little bit later in the podcast. Jim, let's start with our good martini. And, you know, we mock people a lot, politicians who say on day one, I'm going to do this. And we're like, yeah, you're not really going to do it on day one. It's going to take you a few weeks, a few months. And Ron DeSantis, he waited till day 3. So it wasn't day 1, but it's pretty darn close. Ron DeSantis replacing Scott Israel as the sheriff of Broward County. Here's the Tampa Bay Times via the Miami Herald. Governor Ron DeSantis on Friday appointed Gregory Toney, a former Coral Springs police sergeant, as Broward's top cop, replacing Scott Israel, the embattled sheriff who has been widely blamed for the chaotic response to the February 14th, 2018 shootings at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland. Israel, 62, was suspended by DeSantis just 3 days after the new governor took his oath of office. The two-term sheriff, a 30-year law enforcement veteran, has vowed to fight any effort to strip him of his elected office. He maintains that while mistakes were made, that's putting it mildly, in responding to the rampage, they were not serious enough to warrant his suspension or removal. So he's going to fight this. From what I understand, most of the deputies showed up at the announcement of the new sheriff than to stand with Sheriff Israel. And interestingly enough, two folks that you wouldn't expect to be on the same side of this move are on the same side of this move. You've got Andrew Pollack, who's very closely aligned himself with Trump and other conservatives on this issue. His daughter, Meadow Pollack, was killed at the high school shooting there. He's in favor of this, as is Fred Guttenberg, who some folks might remember was the guy who tried to shake Brett Kavanaugh's hand at that confirmation hearing last year, who's very much coming at from a gun control perspective. So, Jim, not only this, but very early on, DeSantis nominating Barbara Lagoa, a Federalist Society figure who is considered a home run by family groups for the Florida State Supreme Court. So you always like to start off with a bang, and Ron DeSantis seems to be doing it quite well here.
Yeah, we can start with Sheriff Scott Israel. You're kind of surprised that you didn't see more officials stepping in. And, fighting incompetence is always going to have broad bipartisan appeal. And I don't understand how you could be a Broward County resident and feel safer. I love that little quote you gave there, Greg. Mistakes were made. Isn't it amazing how these sentences don't have subjects? Mistakes, they just happened. By whom? Oh, we're not going to get into that. It's just these things happen. So, look, yeah, is it possible Israel can try to sue or try to argue that his termination is he can try to argue that in court. I don't think he's going to have a particularly easy time doing it. But again, part of politics is having the right enemies. And when someone has failed in his duties as spectacularly as Israel has, this is an excellent first step. I also want to make two other points. You mentioned the first justice, but also just a few hours ago, he nominated Governor DeSantis nominated Robert Luck, sits on the 3rd District Court of Appeal, will be the first Jewish justice to serve in the state Supreme Court in more than 20 years. Luck is saying all of the right things about, look, Governor, with you standing on my side, I have taken an oath to make the Constitution, not the judiciary, supreme. Everything you want to hear about in terms of judicial activism and legislating from the bench. You mentioned the first Cuban-American woman to serve on the court, but something else I kind of like there was an observation. This is occurring because there are 7 members of the state Supreme Court. 3 justices have to retire on January because of mandatory retirement ages on the state Supreme Court. Greg, could you imagine what life would be like with mandatory retirement ages on the U.S. Supreme Court? I mean, first of all, we would not have the entire nation's politics driven by how is Ruth Bader Ginsburg feeling today? And we say this, look, I hope Ruth Bader Ginsburg is healthy and hale and hearty and does great. But we've seen this from both parties and justices as they age, this sense of, oh, can you hang on through this presidency? Can you just not die? Can we do a weekend at Bernie's type scenario? Maybe term limits for Supreme Court justices make sense. Maybe a mandatory retirement. Like, it's great that they can do this in Florida, one of the oldest states in the whole union. When people go down to retire, the old joke is that Central Florida is either a wholly owned subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company or it is it's God's waiting room. So, look, if voters in Florida can live with the idea of a mandatory retirement age for state Supreme Court justices, you kind of wonder how hard it would be to convince the rest of the country. Now, maybe it would take a constitutional amendment. I don't know. But just something worth exploring. But overall, just a very hot, fast start for Florida Governor DeSantis.
Yeah, very, very good. And Jim, you know who's leaving? People who were on the Florida Supreme Court during the Bush v. Gore fight back in 2000. So some of these people that made our lives miserable for 36 days, basically agreeing with any cockamamie Gore-Lieberman argument to extend the thing and try to have yet another recount to have the Democrats come out on top, those jokers are finally leaving. So
Greg, I still can't believe they went with the death penalty for Chad. I'm sorry, hanging Chad. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought that was the gallows for Chad, but yes.
Well, if you're 70, which is the mandatory retirement age for Florida State Supreme Court justices, or any age, one way to stay healthy is to have really healthy teeth and gums. We hear that all the time. And so the new year means new resolutions, and we've got one that hopefully you're working on twice every day. It's your oral health, and with a Quip electric toothbrush, sticking to good habits is simple. The guiding features are like a built-in support system for better brushing.
Now, here's why you should use Quip. First of all, it has sensitive sonic vibrations for an effective clean that's gentle on your sensitive gums. A lot of people brush too hard, and some electric toothbrushes can be too abrasive. There's a built-in 2-minute timer, which pulses every 30 seconds to remind you when to switch sides and help you clean your whole mouth evenly. Apparently, more than 90% of us don't brush for a full 2 minutes, or we don't clean evenly. Now, there's a multi-use cover, which works as a stand. It mounts to mirrors, and it slides over your bristles to pack and protect your Quip on the go. Also, there are no wires, no clunky charger, and it can run for 3 months on a single charge. Brush heads are automatically delivered on a dentist-recommended schedule every 3 months for just $5. A friendly reminder when it's time to refresh and stay committed to your oral health. And remember, apparently 3/4 of us use old, worn-out bristles that just aren't effective for cleaning your teeth. Quip is one of the first electric toothbrushes accepted by the American Dental Association. They're backed by more than 25,000 dental professionals, and they have thousands of verified 5-star reviews. Greg, I have used it once today, and I will use it before I go to sleep because that's what it's there for. Best toothbrush I've ever owned.
Wow. And that's why Jim loves Quip. And you know what I like about Quip too, Jim? They let both hosts try it. And
Good.
Except I never got to try it because it got sent to my house, and my wife says, "Oh, this looks really cool. I'm trying this one." And she loves it. She's so excited to keep using it. It's a fantastic product and best toothbrush.
Quip, it's a toothbrush worth stealing.
Right. So that's why we love Quip and why over 1 million happy, healthy mouths do too. Quip starts at just $25, really. For an electric toothbrush, that's fantastic. And if you go to getquip.com/martini right now, you can get that first refill pack for free. That's your first refill pack free at getquip.com/martini. All right, Jim, on to our bad martini now. And regular listeners to the 3 Martini Lunch will know that we foreshadowed this a couple of weeks back because a lot of people were making noise about running, and now we're starting to find out that they actually are running. And we know that Julian Castro is running. We know that Elizabeth Warren's running. And now we know that Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard is running. She made the interesting choice of announcing this on national television. I use that in quotes. On the Van Jones Show on CNN.
There's some common sense ideas like this, technology innovation or whatever, but it's hard to get them done with the existing arrangement. Are you going to run for president of the United States and do something about it? Do you think you should? Do you think you should? Are you going to run?
I have decided to run and will be making a formal announcement within the next week.
Whoa.
So, Jim, as we've discussed a number of times, even just late last week, Tulsi Gabbard is one of those few Democrats where she's going to surprise you from time to time. She just confronted members of her own party, including her own Democratic Senator Mazie Hirono, about Hirono and Kamala Harris and Dianne Feinstein going after Catholic nominees, including just membership in the Knights of Columbus being a problem. She also went after Barack Obama for refusing to call Islamic extremism what it was. But then she pals around with Bashar Assad and defends him, not really sure when most of the evidence, if not all the evidence, shows that he was using chemical weapons on his own people. The Democrats aren't really excited about her. She blew the whistle on them for rigging the process against Bernie Sanders. She was an ardent Sanders supporter in 2016. They're also dredging up things from the 2000s where she was opposed to same-sex marriage, because no national Democrats were opposed to same-sex marriage at that time. So what do you make of Gabbard running? She's still under 40 years old, for example, getting into this race, and the reaction it's getting.
Yeah, so the first thing we should give credit for is that she's coming out, she's asked a direct question, are you running? And she says yes. And there's none of this, oh, I'm exploring running, or I'm curious, I'm thinking about it. When you go out, when you're traipsing around Des Moines and Manchester, and you're talking about your vision for the future, look, even if you have an exploratory committee, you're not exploring anymore. You're running. So just cut to the chase. She's probably one of the most interesting and idiosyncratic and unpredictable Democrats in the House today, and arguably in the entire party. That's going to give her certain times where you and I are going to be applauding her. There'll be certain times we're not going to be applauding her. I tried to elaborate on that in today's Morning Jolt. There's a really interesting argument from a guy named Tanner Greer, who writes under T. Greer Twitter, and he kind of lays out the argument in favor of meeting with Assad, which, as you and I would probably agree, there's not a terribly strong argument, but the general gist is, look, we've seen the Middle East be a big, complicated, violent mess for a very long time. The contention is that American interests are best served by these brutal dictators who might be really, really brutal. They might be absolutely bloodthirsty. They might do terrible things that we could never excuse or never say were morally justified. But generally, they keep the divisions under wraps. They generally keep things suppressed, and you end up with less terrorism and less violence targeting Americans when regimes like this are in charge. This is not necessarily a crazy viewpoint. I can see there are respected people who have this argument, and you can look at the Mubaraks of the world. You can certainly say it's not like the Jordanian kingdom is full of respectful of human rights and never punishes prisoners in harsh ways and has free elections and things like that. All over the Middle East, they've got autocracies and monarchies and regimes like that are not in keeping with American values, that do not have particularly good human rights records. But it's, the sort of thing where the United States is going to look the other way because they're on our side, either back in the Cold War or today in the fight against the war against terrorism. A lot of examples of this. And I think the best case scenario would be for this to begin a serious discussion amongst Americans about when are we willing to ally ourselves with a dictator or a royal family like the one in Saudi Arabia that does terrible things if they say they're going to help us on our priorities. When is it worth it? When is the cost worth, justify? When does the benefit justify the cost? The problem is, and he uses the example of, if Bashar Assad had won the Syrian civil war in 2013, wouldn't the world be a better place? Wouldn't we see, much less massacres? You wouldn't see waves of refugees. You wouldn't see ISIS being able to take root the way they are. That all sounds really appealing, but I can't help but notice that, Bashar Assad has no shortage in the brutality department, and he couldn't end the war in 2013. So it's kind of it's an interesting question, but it's kind of moot. Brutal dictators, sometimes they can keep a lid on things. And then sometimes their methods are so brutal and horrific that it spurs greater opposition to them, expanding the field of the conflict and making the war worse. I think you can look at a whole bunch of these regimes and you conclude, hey, you know what? In the long run, that was not a great deal for the United States of America. We ended up backing a guy who was absolutely terrible. And not only do we not live up to our own values, not only do we have to avert our eyes from terrible things, in the end, that partnership did not work out the way we wanted it to, i.e., Marcos in the Philippines, Saddam Hussein, the Shah in Iran. There are a bunch of times we've ended up backing somebody and it turned out we were backing the wrong course. But even further, the Greer argument is the reason we do these alliances with dictatorships is we want to get out of the Middle East completely. Which is interesting how Gabbard doesn't sound all that different from Trump on this. And the problem is, if you imagine, it's wonderful. You have this vision of, we wash our hands in the Middle East. We'd never have to deal with these folks ever again. We're becoming energy independent. We, just let them solve their own problems. We're tired of it. We're tired of dealing with this. Well, if we leave, it's not going to get nicer. If we leave, it's not going to get more peaceful. If anything, it's probably going to get much more violent. You're going to see 1,000 fights like Yemen going on, where it's basically the Sunnis against the Shia. And I just don't buy this idea that the problems that would start from a giant Sunni-Shia war in the Middle East would end up staying in the Middle East. I went back and looked back at the 80s and the terrorism that grew out of the conflict in Lebanon and Iran, and chances are the problems would not stay in the Middle East. Sooner or later, that would end up on our doorstep. We were much less involved in the Middle East then, and we still had terrible terrorist attacks, hijackings, the Achille Laurel, Pan Am Flight 103, blowing up West Berlin discos, American embassies, European airports. Terrorism was really bad in the 1980s, and we were not nearly as involved. We didn't have nearly as many troops in the Middle East as we do now. So, in that case, you withdraw and you still have the same problems. Anyway, I'd like to see this debate really get rolling in the Democratic presidential primary, because I think Gabbard met with Assad probably is not a sufficient argument. I'd like to see people who are upset about this explain. Tulsi Gabbard met with Assad, and here's why it's bad. Here's hoping, Greg, but I'm not terribly optimistic about that.
Yeah, it's interesting that she's getting in, though, and the Democrats claim they're going to have everybody on the same stage no matter how many people actually join this race. But I got to say, she's probably the only person who's even contemplating this race who could actually end up on that stage and have an answer to a question that I couldn't predict.
Trump bad is going to be the subtext.
Right.
Pretty much every answer.
Exactly right. I remember when there was, Iraq war stuff going on in 2004, and Lieberman was the only one sticking up for it. That made the debate interesting. In 2008, it was more anti-Iraq war stuff, and at that point, Joe Biden, who wasn't as far to the right as Joe Lieberman on the Iraq war, was the one who was kind of contradicting everybody else. And so it'll be interesting to watch how Gabbard handles that issue. Like I said before, she's a Bernie Sanders supporter, so she's pretty far to the left on a lot of the domestic stuff, and I don't expect any conservatives to go flocking to her. But she does defy conventional wisdom sometimes, which makes for interesting politics.
I'll take unpredictable and interesting over, and I disagree with, than the other way.
Yes.
than boring and predictable, because we're going to get no shortage of those servings of that in the 2020 presidential election.
Yeah, I forgot who coined it first, but you're going to have 15 people up there talking about Orange Man bad, like you said, and so a little nuance could be good. All right, let's move on to our crazy martini now, Jim. And as we have said many times over the last couple of years, it wasn't Donald Trump's best Twitter weekend, but he went off on a number of things. But one of the things he went off on was reporting in the Washington Post and the New York Times that the FBI actually opened an investigation on Trump following his firing of Jim Comey in May of 2017. To find out if he was an actual asset of the Russians, whether he was working for the Russians. And so this, of course, has everyone who doesn't like Trump drooling, waiting to see the Mueller report. But on ABC's This Week program, Jonathan Karl, chief White House correspondent for ABC, dumping a massive bucket of cold water on that speculation.
This is all building up to the Mueller report and raising expectations of a bombshell report. And there have been expectations that have been building, of course, for over a year on this. But people who are closest to what Mueller has been doing, who have interacted with the special counsel, caution me that this report is almost certain to be anticlimactic. That if you look at what the FBI was investigating in that New York Times report, you look at what they were investigating, Mueller did not go anywhere with that investigation. He has been writing his report in real time through these indictments, and we have seen nothing from Mueller on the central question of, was there any coordination, collusion with the Russians in the effort to meddle in the elections? Or was there even any knowledge on the part of the president or anybody in his campaign with what the Russians were doing?
Jim, both sides are going to end up hating Bob Mueller, just like they ended up hating Jim Comey, right?
Yeah. So a couple things jump out of that. First of all, that New York Times story sounds really super duper dramatic. In 2017, the Federal Bureau of Investigation decided to open an investigation to see if Donald Trump was a Russian agent. Okay, it's 2019. What did they find? because the opening of the investigation, that sounds very serious. But if you look into it and say, no, he's not. Well, then it's not such a big deal at all. Now, if you do find stuff, then yeah. But again, it's January 14th, 2019. Greg, I don't know about you, but if the FBI finds evidence that the president of the United States is, secretly being controlled or manipulated or blackmailed or even willingly conspiring with Russian intelligence, I'd like to know sooner rather than later. That doesn't seem like the sort of thing you leave sitting on somebody's desk over a long weekend or something like that. That seems like information we'd need to have sooner rather than later. And the fact that we haven't heard from, the FBI, either from Comey or I guess it was after the Comey firing, any FBI official say, by the way, America, it turns out the president's been working for the Russians all along. You probably should know about that. Good luck with that impeachment thing, House and Senate. See ya. They haven't said anything like that. Making me, and it's, Karl points out, this really hasn't been what Mueller's focusing. Now, again, could Mueller come out and say, oh, by the way, boom, here is the smoking gun evidence that Trump and Putin are conspiring together? I guess he could. But what Karl's saying he's hearing is not that. And I think it's going to be, it was Ed Morrissey over at Hot Air who used the comparison to Fitzmas, the old former prosecutor of Patrick Fitzgerald, who was going to, Karl Rove had been given 24 hours to get his affairs in order, and then they're going to frog march him in handcuffs and all that stuff. It ended up not happening. Hearing somebody's about to indict somebody or about to charge somebody is a very big deal. But until it actually happens, it's just rumors, and kind of left wondering, what did the FBI find? My sneaking suspicion is if they found something really bad, we would have heard by now.
It's fascinating to watch all this, Jim, and just how people's opinions change on the slightest bit of information. I remember we got the Attorney General confirmation hearings this week, right? Bill Barr. Yep. One of the reasons he probably got the nomination was because he wrote this either memo or column or something talking about the complaints he had with the Mueller investigation. So everybody on the right is excited. Everybody on the left is very upset. And now Barr is set to testify tomorrow that he thinks Mueller should finish his investigation. And it turns out these guys are really good friends and they've been invited to their kids' weddings. And so now the right's really worried about him and the left's like, maybe this guy's not so bad after all.
Yeah, just one last prediction there, Greg, that if Mueller's report comes out and it's a dud, if he comes out and he says, look, no collusion, bad contacts by the lower level folks in the campaign, but I can't prove that Trump knew about any of it. No evidence Trump was, contacting Russians, et cetera, et cetera. My prediction, Greg, is that that'll be the last time Robert De Niro ever plays Robert Mueller on Saturday Night Live ever again. One of the regular cast members will take over, and all of a sudden he'll become Mr. Magoo, the guy who can't see anything, can't find anything, and is a, bumbling Keystone Cop. It'll turn on a dime the moment that report comes out, if it says something like that.
Oh, man. This is just too much. We'll see. It's coming soon, we think. He just argued for I think he got a 6-month extension for his grand jury. So we'll see when it all wraps up. But I have to assume it'll be sometime this year, hopefully in the next couple of months. Jim, good start to the week. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And don't forget to get that great Quip toothbrush starting at just $25. GetQuip.com/martini and get your first refill pack of brushes free. And tune in again Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.